Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Tips to Optimize Performance and Management of Your Digital Workspace. My name is Sarah Queen, and I'm the Senior Marketing Manager for our services portfolio here at Citrix. In today's session, our Citrix consulting team will share leading practices tailored to the specific challenges of managing a high-performance Citrix environment, helping you to tune up and maximize your digital workspace. We will then close with the managed services offerings that are available to support your success. Before we go into the presentation, let me quickly review a few housekeeping details. We will have a live Q&A session towards the end of today's event, and you're welcome to submit your questions during the presentation. Simply type your question into the Ask a Question window and click Submit. Also, we are recording this event, and the on-demand version will be available from the same link that you used to join today. So feel free to come back, watch the archive, or share it with your colleagues. And finally, the slides are available for download from the Event Resources tab located along the top of the interface. Okay, now I will hand it over to Nick Rentalen, Principal Architect and Senior Director on our Americas Professional Services team. Nick leads our largest deployments and continues to build his social stardom through Citrix blogs. Nick?
Thanks, Sarah. So what's on tap for today? Well, I'm first going to share a few tips and tricks related to optimizing performance of your Citrix environment. This webinar will be focused on our classic Citrix virtualization products that many of you use, namely XenApp, XenDesktop, PVS, etc. If you look at the agenda slide here, I'll be covering the first 4 items, and then I'll turn it over to my partner in crime, Greg, to talk through the last 4 items, which are more related to the operational aspects or management of your Citrix environment. So let's get to it. The first item has to do with a popular question I still receive from many partners and customers, and that is how many users or VMs can I squeeze on a box? Something we refer to as SSS, or single server scalability. Of course, there are a lot of factors that go into this, but I'm a big fan of keeping things simple. So I made up a rule this past year in an attempt to dramatically simplify the answer to this age-old question. It's called the rule of 5 and 10. Since most XenDesktop and XenApp workloads are CPU-bound these days, simply take the number of physical cores in the box and multiply by 5 or 10. And that will produce a number that can be used to easily estimate single server scalability for XenDesktop and XenApp workloads respectively. So if you have a blade with dual processors and 14 cores in each proc, that means you have a total of 28 physical cores in the box. If you're looking to estimate XenDesktop scalability, then multiply 28 by 5, and you can be fairly confident that you'll get somewhere in the neighborhood of 140 VMs on each blade. If you're estimating XenApp user density, multiply by 10 instead, or simply double that VDI number. And be confident again that you'll get somewhere in the neighborhood of 280 users on each blade. I'll say it again, your mileage will definitely vary, but if this sounds too easy, well, that's the point. So check out my article there for more details and sizing examples. We say this often, but performance tuning and optimizations really do make a difference when it comes to single server scalability. Our friends at LoginVSI showed one example where they tuned a Windows 10 image with their VDI like a pro template. This is free, by the way, and it's basically just OS optimizations and a few additional tweaks. They were able to get almost 50% more VMs on the box versus the vanilla or untuned image. Pretty amazing result, and it shows the power of tuning a default Windows image. The last thing I wanted to touch on here is graphics codecs, because these can have a big impact on not only scalability, but also user experience, which is the other mystery we're trying to solve here. After all, there's a balance between these two competing forces, and we're trying to maximize user density while providing the best user experience. That, in a nutshell, is the name of the game. Many of you noticed that when we moved to the 7.x architecture, the video codec, or H.264, was the default graphics codec or engine used. And while that provides a great user experience due to the high frame rate, H.264 also chews up CPU pretty good. So we rewrote ThinWire for modern operating systems. You might hear this referred to as ThinWire Plus, and we kept improving it over the last 10 or so releases. And now it's the default graphics codec used in the latest builds versus H.264 that was previously the default, as I mentioned. The result is still a really good user experience, but much better SSS at the same time. How much better? Well, we typically see about a 10% improvement in scalability when toggling H.264 and ThinWire Plus. Sound complicated? Well, the good news is we have templates, and they're super easy to apply based on the use case. If you're after the best scalability or WAN-friendly codec, then the first couple templates in the table will enable the ThinWire Plus engine I talked about. If you're after the best user experience at all costs, select the high def policy, and it will automatically enable the video codec or H.264. And lastly, if you're using a legacy OS, such as Windows 7 or 2008 R2, select one of the last templates and it'll force legacy thinwire, which is optimized for those particular Microsoft platforms. Pretty straightforward. And the best part is you can customize these templates, mix and match policies for different user groups, etc. One last thing I wanted to touch on before I get to my next favorite subject of login times. And that is a breakthrough we made about 4 or 5 months ago with the 7.13 release. We basically found a way to reduce bandwidth by about 50% by doing nothing more than upgrading to the latest receiver and VDA versions. I'm not joking. It's just that easy, and there are no other tweaks or hardware required. It's all done in software, and it doesn't impact single server scalability or user experience. So if you're on the current release track versus our LTSR track, then it's definitely worth checking out 7.13 or 7.14, which was actually just released this past week. All right, next up, login times. Another subject near and dear to my heart. Next up, login times. Another subject near and dear to my heart. I've also been asked a lot over the years, what's a good login time? Or is our login time average or worse than industry standards or our competitors? So I created another simple guideline that I call the rule of 30. If you're under 30 seconds, you're doing pretty well. If you're over 30 or closer to a minute, then something is probably not quite right and you can do better. So that's a good measuring stick if you're wondering where you stand. But if you're closer to a minute or longer, and trust me, I've seen everything from 5 seconds to 15 minutes, then the first place I'd recommend looking is the profile and policy design. Because more often than not, something easy like folder redirection isn't configured, or a shell folder that should be excluded isn't in the exclusions list, or there are too many GPOs or a lack of group policy preferences, which are handy for things like drive mappings and login scripts. So if you take a hard look at profiles and policies, you can usually find something to shave off maybe 5 or 10 seconds of your login time. And if you're looking at Director and you can't make sense of the interactive session metric, or why it still shows incredibly long durations despite every tweak in the book, then check out the article there that one of our awesome CTPs wrote. I mentioned GPPs earlier, preferences, but we have another tool in our tool belt when it comes to reducing login times, and that is Workspace Environment Manager, or WEM. Courtesy of our recent acquisition of Northscale, this smart agent can be used to extract key items such as login scripts and GPOs, and process those things in parallel after we load the desktop shell, as opposed to processing these items sequentially and postponing the shell initialization to the very end. Let me just build this out here. So this snazzy animation on the screen illustrates this. What might be a 45-second logon time without WEM can be transformed into a 15-second login time. Your mileage will obviously vary, but the more GPOs, GPPs, drive, and printer mappings you have, the more WEM can shave off. So it's definitely something to check out if you haven't already. Our consulting team's been doing a lot of WEM lately, and customers are really happy with the results, specifically around reducing login times. Now, the last major topic I wanted to touch on today is image and profile management. Yes, we still have 2 provisioning technologies at Citrix today, and we're seeing customers use both of them. PVS is still the go-to tech, I'd say, especially when it comes to large enterprises that need its more sophisticated operational features compared to MCS today. But with the move to cloud and the equivalent RAM caching with overflow to disk capability, we're seeing a lot more MCS than we used to. I just mentioned the first tip or trick, but if you're not already, we're recommending that CIR WOTD, that cache and RAM with overflow to disk functionality. Definitely enable that. It's a game changer in terms of storage throughput and eliminating the pesky IOPS problem. It also probably goes without saying, but we still recommend maintaining a few copies of each vdisk or image in case you need to revert. And the last tip is something our CCS team employs a lot these days, and that's doing things like versioning and merging out of band. And what we mean by that is we typically like to set up an extra PVS server and associated vdisk store. And we'll do those operational tasks on that isolated box in the store so production's never touched. Then once we're ready with our new version or freshly merged image, we'll copy it back over to our production PVS servers and associated stores. It's all about mitigating risk and preventing outages, and this is an easy way to keep things safe. I put this graphic in here because I wanted to make sure everyone knew that MCS has the same cache and RAM with overflow to disk functionality that PVS has enjoyed for a while. This came to the on-prem version of our products about a year ago, and Citrix Cloud also has this functionality as of the new year. And you can see from the bar graphs there, the performance and dramatic reduction of write IOPS is on par with PVS. So definitely take advantage no matter which provisioning technology you choose. I already covered most of the user profile design considerations earlier when I was on my soapbox about folder redirection and exclusions, but I'll say one more thing, and that is we don't necessarily recommend jumping to Citrix UPM or profile management. If you can get away with a simple mandatory profile for your use case or apps, great, do it. If a standard Microsoft roaming profile with folder direction of every shell folder can get the job done, that's good as well, stick with it. But if you have more complex requirements or something that truly warrants a third-party profile solution, such as last write or win scenarios, then UPM or something like absence or res will definitely be there waiting for you. As for our Citrix Profile Management product, or UPM, we're currently shipping version 5.8 that we just dropped with the 7.14 release this past week. It has full support for the latest Windows 10 builds and Server 2016. And we recently made some improvements to IE cookie handling, active write-back, and profile streaming. So it's worth a look at the latest release if you haven't checked it out already. One last design consideration I wanted to mention before I turn it over to Greg. We still recommend separate profiles for each version or Microsoft platform. And what I mean by that is Microsoft introduced a different version of profiles when they introduced the Vista platform many years ago. There were version 1 profiles up to that point, and since they changed the user profile namespace, and in turn a lot of the shell folders in that Vista release, those became version 2 profiles. We thought there might be, we didn't think there would be any more versions after that, especially since Windows 7 was still version 2 and it was using the same namespace. But fast forward 5 to 10 years later, and here we are talking about version 6 profiles associated with Server 2016 and the latest Windows 10 releases. So the net-net is these profile versions are all slightly different, and they shouldn't be mixed and matched, or combined like you might want to make things easier. So resist the urge, play it safe, and create a separate profile for each user that leverages a different Microsoft platform. Hopefully that provides you with a few tips and tricks to optimize performance of your digital workspace. If you're interested in the tune-up of your Citrix environment, whether it be increasing server scalability or reducing login times, our consulting team is always here to help, and we offer quick one-week health checks to do things like this all the time. So don't be afraid to reach out, and we look forward to working with you soon. Thanks for listening, and I'll now turn it over to Greg to talk through change management, among some other things. Greg?
Perfect. Thanks, Nick. Hello, everybody. Next section we're going to talk about is change management. Change management can have wide ramifications on your Citrix environment. If application updates are done in a controlled manner, one at a time, you can trace back any negative impacts and correct them. If they're done haphazardly, such as creating policies on the fly or performing tasks out of sequence, the results can be significant: system instability, extended downtime, and the need to engage incident management. That's why Citrix Consulting recommends classifying changes into 3 types and following a standard procedure for each type. The definition for changes within the ITIL standard are standard, normal, and emergency. The pyramid in this graphic is used to illustrate that while standard changes are common, emergency changes should be few and far between to promote environment stability. Let me start that one again. The definition for changes within ITIL are standard, normal, and emergency. The pyramid in this slide is used to illustrate that while standard changes are common, emergency changes should be few and far between for true environment stability. This disciplined approach to change management is valuable for your entire IT system, not just the Citrix environment. It avoids scenarios where every change is considered critical, thus preventing the type of change prioritization. Standard changes are, in effect, approved in advance and should be well understood. They should not require testing in a non-production environment prior to implementation. Examples of standard changes may be something as simple as resetting a user's account password, disconnecting or resetting a Citrix session through a management console, or perhaps even simply calling users back. These are low-impact, common changes and are seen as day-to-day operational support. These are the types of things that your help desk is typically going to deal with through their management console. Normal changes involve adding and/or changing configurations of a known Citrix infrastructure. These require approval from the Change Advisory Board before they can be implemented. Examples of Normal changes might be known application updates or publications of applications, required registry changes, user profile changes, or installation of drivers. These are things that would typically be done during your normal change window with approval from your change advisory board. The final change type are emergency changes. Emergency changes should be kept to an absolute minimum. They may involve a server reboot, a security issue, or perhaps an unexpected patch. These changes are typically done prior to approval from the change advisory board due to the nature of their requirements, but should still be presented to the change advisory board after the fact. As I mentioned, these are something that we want to keep to a minimum. However, they do need to be recorded through the change advisory board so that you're aware of what the changes are, and hopefully this can be prevented moving forward. Let's move on to testing. Success with XenApp and XenDesktop is all about mission-critical applications. When you're delivering virtualized applications, it's vital to provide a user experience that is as close to local desktop experience as possible. That means high performance, especially with graphical applications, high availability, and as Nick mentioned, faster login times. What you want to avoid is rolling out a mission-critical application without prior testing and running into all kinds of user problems that can, one, overwhelm your help desk, or even worse, turn people off to the concept of virtualization. So how do you boost your chances for smooth deployment? User acceptance testing. By using a test environment that is separate from your production environment, you gain the freedom to adjust and fine-tune the deployment and get feedback from the test users before general deployment. This can avoid the embarrassment of a rollout that doesn't work properly and gives your users a bad impression of virtualization. If you do not have a separate test environment, Citrix Consulting and Managed Services can work with the application owners or subject matter experts to conduct user acceptance testing using leading practices within a production environment. Again, not recommended, but something that, if the situation arises, we certainly can do. All right, this slide was actually removed from the original, so I'll pause there, but we should cut this one out. So moving on, let's discuss Citrix Managed Services. At Citrix Managed Services, we care and manage for Citrix infrastructures as if they were our own. This is a common theme that you'll see, and I'll bring it back at the end, but I want you to be aware that we do consider ourselves an extension of your existing Citrix support team. So where ultimately does Citrix Managed Services fit into the overall consulting model? A key element of the success of Citrix Consulting is the proven methodology which takes each project through critical steps from inception through operation. Our approach focuses on ensuring that projects are properly planned and designed before implementation begins, so that the end project minimizes your risk and delivers maximum business impact. You can see here we break our projects down into phases: define, assess, design and deploy, and then ultimately manage. In Define, Citrix Consulting can assist in the definition of the strategy that will help your business take full advantage of virtualization and cloud technologies through solution development, roadmap initiatives and strategic planning, hardware and storage estimations, and prioritization. Within Assess, think of the center of our diagram as the heart of your project. During the Assess phase, Citrix Consulting reviews your environment, identifies use cases, and gathers detailed requirements for your project. This information allows us to elaborate on project success criteria and set goals for your Citrix deployment, upgrade, or expansion. Within Design and Deploy, the design phase defines the architecture and operational processes required to implement and maintain the production environment that will meet and hopefully exceed your success criteria. Topics such as scalability, redundancy, and high availability are addressed. Citrix Consulting will apply leading practices for performance tuning and help your environment perform at its best. That means your environment is rigorously tested during this phase to make sure your deployment runs smoothly. At this point, you've got a net new environment, it's been built up, but who's going to manage it moving forward? Take care of that day-to-day operational support. Within Manage, we have Citrix Managed Services. Citrix Managed Services can be engaged to perform continued monitoring and administrative tasks in several different capacities for the long-term health of your Citrix environment. We have the expertise to keep your environment stable and your users happy with both on-site and remote delivery capabilities. So what is Citrix Managed Services? Citrix Managed Services can ultimately be defined within 3 common practices, and those are service operations, service transition, and continual service improvement. Under service operations, this is really your day-to-day operational support. This is going to involve things such as event and incident management, problem management, and request fulfillment, the type of things you see in daily operations that keep the lights on in your environment. Service transition is going to be kind of that next level up. This is transition planning and support, configuration management, and change and release and deployment management. These are going to be things that involve your change advisory board and that are ultimately planned out through the board and approved. This is not really project-based work, but kind of formal structure around day-to-day operations and support. And finally, continual service improvement. Review, analyze, and prioritize your environment. Let's understand what happened previously to either make sure we do more of that if the outcome was good, or it doesn't happen again if the outcome was unexpected. These are the foundations on which Citrix Managed Services is built. When we talk about foundations, Citrix Managed Services is a heavy ITIL-based organization. And within ITIL, there are defined processes and functions that kind of dictate the type of work that we do. What you see here are all of the ITIL processes broken out across the various pillars. Really where Citrix Managed Services focuses in is in the transition and operation phase, which was kind of reflective in the previous slide. Things such as our service desk, event management, incident management, change management. I mentioned care for your Citrix infrastructure as if it were our own. By integrating with your teams within your incident management system, within your change management process and your incident management process, we're going to be able to become an extension of your team and ultimately have a repeatable process because we are working within the ITIL framework. With cloud being the new buzzword that everyone is talking about, I'd like to take a moment to discuss our Citrix Managed Services offering for the cloud, Citrix Managed Workload Services. With this offering, CMS is going to be focused on workload management. This is similar to what you would already be familiar with on-premise deployment, only in this case, the control plane is going to be supported by the Citrix Cloud team. Citrix Managed Services will handle incident management, change management, as well as day-to-day proactive and reactive support for your organization's workflows that are running within the Citrix delivery infrastructure. To help further define what I was speaking on the previous slide, let's look at Workspace Cloud in a broader perspective, one that shows how Citrix now offers a spectrum of possible route to market for our value propositions. On the far left is our traditional software route to market. IT manages all aspects of installation, management, etc. They have full control over all pieces, but not all customers require this. On the far right is a completely hosted route to market, where a third party, perhaps a service provider, MSP, Citrix CSP, is going to host the entire Citrix environment on behalf of the customer, and the customers receive all control to the provider. Of course, the provider uses this traditional approach on the left when creating their own environment. In the center, we are introducing Workspace Cloud. This approach simplifies how customers and partners can access Citrix products and services. Its service provides easier and faster workspace creation than our traditional approach on the left, yet provides more control than complete workspace outsourcing on the right. As you can see from the operational matrix, Citrix Cloud, when partnered with Citrix Managed Services, provides you with a complete turnkey solution for your hosted virtual delivery infrastructure. One of the key aspects to Citrix Managed Services is our racing matrix, and this is ultimately how we're able to engage to the slide that I spoke to previously, where we have a customer and a service provider involved and Citrix Managed Services. How do we all work together? We develop a racing matrix. The racing matrix is ultimately a responsibility matrix. For those of you that are familiar with ITIL, this is going to be who is responsible, accountable, consulted, or informed. By using this, we can get very granular and clearly define the responsibilities for each party within that supported environment. We track who does what within each process, so who is going to be consulted if a change needs to be made, who is responsible for that change, etc., enabling decisions to be made with confidence. You as a customer know that you're responsible for this component, but you're going to be consulted on this, and the same thing with the partner and managed services. It gives you that confidence of who is owning what component and how the overall workflow is going to work, and it's ultimately going to promote end-to-end visibility for each process. Everybody is aware who controls which touch point throughout the process so that we can move to resolution or implementation in the most rapid fashion. The Citrix advantages. In summary, we are the vendor. We know how to best support our product in your environment. We are engaged in all market verticals and industries and have seen a wide array of mission-critical applications deployed in many unique configurations. We complete the Citrix professional services lifecycle. Benefits. Citrix services can help you make the most of your Citrix investment. Our in-house experts have the most up-to-date information that spans the full Citrix stack, providing an unparalleled level of comprehensive support. With Citrix services, you are going to see enhanced time to value, accelerated consumption, and increased daily use activities. This basically means that your investment is going to be realized more quickly. You're going to have better end user adoption. Happier users are going to be more likely to use a virtualized environment than a local environment. If they're doing that, you can add more users into the system and ultimately add new products in, thereby completely utilizing the investment that you've made within the Citrix product suite. That ultimately wraps up my section of this. Now, before we move into the Q&A, I would like to remind our audience that if you have a question for our speakers, you can submit it in the Ask a Question area on your screen. Simply type your question into the text box and then hit Submit. Thank you for your time today.
Thanks, Greg. Hi, everyone. This is Nick again, and we're now going to open it up for questions. We've already received a few questions throughout the webinar, so we'll start in the order we received them, but please feel free to continue submitting questions as we go here. Before I take the first question, I wanted to quickly introduce two other colleagues, Emilio Fuentes and Brendan Lin. Emilio works with Greg and actually runs our managed services team globally. He's a senior director and been around Citrix for about 20 years. And Brendan is one of our resident virtualization SMEs and covers the West business from a professional services perspective. He's a senior architect and has been with Citrix Consulting for the last 13 years. So between the four of us, I think we'll have you covered today. But if we can't answer your question or don't get to your question, we'll either follow up directly offline or maybe even post a blog article if there's lots of questions we can't get to. But let's get to it. The first question is, let's see, how would Citrix Managed Services integrate and establish change control practices in our environment? Emilio, do you want to tackle that one?
I will. Thanks a lot, Nick, for the intro, and thanks a lot for attending the webinar. Citrix Managed Services, as you know, it's more specific to the operational support and day-to-day activities at the customer side. One of those activities is change control. Change control is one of the things that introduce a lot of instability to an environment if executed incorrectly. So one of the first things that we do when we onboard our customers is go through their change control practices and establish the responsibilities using an RACI matrix. One of the things that we look at very closely is the amount of emergency changes that our customer have in their day-to-day activity. If you measure the amount of emergency changes, you will get to have a very good understanding of how stable that customer environment is. So that is one of the metrics that we keep close to our heart when looking at change control. In summary, the most important part is to work with the change advisory board in our customers and establish a RACI matrix that clearly defines who's responsible, who's accountable, who's consulted, and who's informed of every change control. Many customers have already tools for managing change control. If they don't, we help them through the process of establishing one. Hopefully that covers it.
Gotcha. Yep. Thanks, Emilio. The second question we have here is, I hear a lot about WEM and reducing login times. Can WEM also be used to improve scalability? Brendan, do you want to take a stab at that one?
Sure thing. Yeah, absolutely. There's two main parts to the WEM equation, I think of it. One is reducing profile load time. The other really is optimizing the user workspace environment, so that translates into increasing the single service scalability. And the way that works is the NorthScale agent includes some kind of machine learning algorithm to monitor and analyze all the user and application behavior in real time. So it's looking at all the processes like Excel macros or Internet Explorer. And what it will do is intelligently adjust that RAM and CPU and the I/O or that given server or workload. And the configuration is highly customizable, even with the default set. So there's a default configuration out of the box. We've seen performance improvements up to like 10 to 20%. But as I mentioned, it's highly customizable. You could whitelist or blacklist specific processes to provide different levels of CPU clamping or so on and so forth. And yeah, in my opinion, I think that the performance optimization or the resource management side is probably one of the biggest benefits of having NorthScale. So very excited about it.
Awesome. Thanks, Brendan. The third question we have here is, how is the Citrix Managed Workload Service sold? Emilio, probably the best one for you there.
I'll tackle that one. It's sold via, you can attach it to a Citrix Cloud product, or you could sell it by itself after a customer has a standing operational Citrix Cloud environment. It doesn't really matter if the customers have their workloads in another cloud provider or on-prem. It is the same SKU or product for both scenarios.
Okay. Thanks, Emilio. Next question we have here is, what's the difference between selective H.264 that I've heard about, H.264, and ThinWire Plus? I'll actually take that one, and it's a great question since I probably didn't do the best job of explaining that today when I touched on codecs. The current default setting right now is actually what we call selective H.264. You can think of that as actually a cross between H.264 and ThinWire Plus, because it's actually ThinWire Plus at the heart of it, but it selectively applies the video codec, or H.264, to any what we call actively changing regions. So selective H.264, it's really a combination of the best of both worlds is how I like to think about it. If we find content on the screen that's relatively static, we'll use the ThinWire Plus engine since that's optimal for that type of content. But if we find content on the screen that's dynamic, we'll apply that H.264 video codec since that works better when there's significant movement on the screen. This has been the default since, I think, 7.11, I believe. And if you want to read up more on this or why we changed it, if you Google HDX just got smarter, there's a good article that goes into a lot more detail. And you can see the corresponding Citrix policies that enable or disable, selective H.264. That's a good one. Next question here from Alexander. Curious about Workspace Environment Manager. Is it a wholesale replacement for UPM? Brendan, you want to talk a little bit more about WEM?
Yeah, sure thing. No, Workspace Environment Manager is not a wholesale replacement for UPM. They work hand in hand. You could think of Workspace Environment Manager more as the ability to configure the profile management policies within Workspace Environment Manager. And as part of the enhancing and accelerating the logon times, one of the considerations is putting more and more knowledge into WEM. So the more it knows about profiles, the more it knows about other settings such as like group policies, the more it's able to make these logon execution processes occur in parallel, so then you get more and more benefits. So they're going to be released separately, so a version in WEM does not include UPM, so they're separate versions, but you can configure profile manager policies through WEM.
Perfect. Thanks, Brendan. And I think that's the last question I'm seeing here in the Q&A pane. So unless anybody has any other questions, I'll refresh one more time here in a few seconds. But unless anybody has anything else, we'll wrap it up. Just wanted to say thanks for tuning in today, and I appreciate everyone's time. Thanks a lot.